Jonathan Dimbleby, and I've written a book, which for me has been a major experience, taking up a lot of time, about the war in the desert during the Second World War. I've always been aware of the Battle of El Alamein and the battle in the desert because my father, Richard Dimbleby, was the BBC's first war correspondent, and for 2 years he was in the desert reporting on a war which was really the only ground war where Britain was able to take up arms against the Germans with some effect. But I never got into the detail of his experience, except insofar as I wrote a biography of him a long time ago and I read his diaries and so forth. And it always intrigued me why we should be fighting in a wasteland, in a desert, in the most inclement environment you could imagine, harsh physically, harsh psychologically, weather extremes, and for what? And that's always intrigued me. So when Profile Books said, would you like to write a book about the Battle of El Alamein, which has its 70th anniversary this autumn, October, November 2012, I thought, well, that's intriguing. I then talked actually to some very distinguished and very successful historians and said, am I completely mad? Because history is not my subject. I'm always interested in history. And they said, no, you'll love it, go for it. So I took a closer look. And the more I read, and the more I began to understand, the more fascinated I became. Not so much about the military to and fro across the desert. I'm not a military historian, although the drama of the desert conflict is quite extraordinary, and I write about that in the book. But essentially trying to answer the question why it was fought. Came across views amongst historians, quite prevalent views, that somehow it was a sideshow, that it was marginal, that it was peripheral. And I've come to the conclusion, and after thinking about it and giving it my best, that actually it wasn't so much peripheral, it's absolutely pivotal to an understanding of the Second World War. So that takes me into the big picture as well as the drama in the desert. It takes me to London, it takes me to Rome, it takes me to Berlin, it takes me to Moscow, and it takes me enormously to Washington and the key war capitals and the war leaders, because I think it is impossible to understand why the Battle of El Alamein happened without understanding the roles of all the major players outside that battle. I also think it shaped the course, not the battle itself, but the Desert War shaped the course of the Second World War. And I found it completely riveting. And of course the Doctor of Wonder is, and I've written quite a lot of books now, but by instinct I'm a reporter and a journalist, and you have to go out and find things and make a judgment about them, try and get it right, and then describe it vividly. In this case, the documents are all there. You have to dig around a bit, but the cables, the letters, the speeches, the diaries, the memoirs are all there to be mined, and I very much enjoyed that journalistic process, and then trying to tell a story that both had historical validity and credibility, but also made you want to read the next page. The first-hand accounts I have been collected by others, the Imperial War Museum, other writers, because now, sadly, but inevitably, there's only a very tiny handful of those who had experienced the war in the desert who survive. And because the material that is already there is so rich, and because the old are so frail, to be frank, I didn't think that I would be able to garner more from yet more voices. I think that the Second World War is going to be written about in decades, in hundreds of years to come. We still write about the Roman wars. We write about wars that happened thousands of years ago, and the Second World War shaped the course of history. So I think it's going to be written about, but we won't have any more, obviously, the first-hand access. And then, to be frank, it then becomes a matter of interpretation of the evidence. The evidence is vast. How do you interpret it? How do you put it in context? How do you make sense of it? And different historians come to the same material and go away with a completely different story. And that's why, as it happens, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the North Africa and the Desert War, historians still fight over it as though it was being conducted at this moment. You're doing the wrong thing. It is, of course, the case that not one moment explains victory or defeat, triumph or disaster. Like airline crashes, there are always a number of causes, and vice versa. When there are triumphs, there are a number of causes. For me, the war in the desert had two very important features. One is it was only fought because we were protecting, Churchill-driven, protecting the British Empire. The Middle East and Cairo was, as it were, the carotid artery of the empire. We depended on the empire. It was vast. No one questioned its validity. It was part of, there was a coalition government, Labour and Conservative. The issue of the empire wasn't discussed. It was there. And we were fighting to defend the empire as a means of fighting what Britain was. Its very identity was umbilically linked to the empire. So that's one thing. The other was that through fighting in the desert and gradually persuading the Americans, both before and then after Pearl Harbor, that fighting in the desert was critical to overall victory, Churchill persuaded Roosevelt, against all the advice of his military senior officers, to fight in North Africa. I mean, the Americans, after Pearl Harbor, wanted first of all to fight, understandably, the Japanese. Churchill persuaded them, and Roosevelt went along, that actually you had to defeat Germany first, and then it would be much easier to defeat the Japanese. He then, and this was the extraordinary diplomatic coup, sustained argument, persuaded Roosevelt, again against the advice of his commanders, that the first Allied venture of the war should not be a cross-channel invasion of France, the Second Front, but North Africa. And he had the temerity, Churchill, to write, after he had won the argument, in a very skillful diplomatic way. He wrote to us saying, "This is the true Second Front, North Africa," which meant that the Americans were effectively helping, and had been helping, to prop up a British empire which they universally deplored and hated. So it's an astonishing story, but because they went into North Africa, because of the empire, they then went to Italy first rather than France, Sicily and Italy, and worked their way up from the south. That mercifully shaped the course of the war. It was a very bloody conflict in Italy, and very much more difficult than the generals had envisaged. But we were spared a premature invasion of France, which would have almost certainly been catastrophic, and there's universal agreement about that. So that's why I say the conflict, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, is pivotal to understanding the course of the Second World War. Like everyone else, I buy books online, speed and efficiency, sometimes cost as well, but that's not for me the principal thing. Going to a bookshop is going into, if it's working well, it's going into a warm, friendly place where you can smell books, where you can browse, where you can come across the unexpected and open it up and look at it, where you feel, if it's, again, they vary, you feel you're sort of at home. And bookshops need to be therefore very welcoming, particularly to those who aren't automatically at home in bookshops. I think I love high streets that have proper shops. High streets which have bookshops are richer than those high streets that don't. Richer by far, because it's part of where would we be without books?